The world record for the deepest dive. Welcome to the world of no-limit freediving, a sport where divers see just how deep they can go. So while an oxygen tank is not permitted, fins and ropes are used to help guide divers. The earliest record of no-limit freediving was not done as a sport, but by ancient people trying to get them some food. The oldest of these is the Chinchorro people. These guys lived in North Chile, and being so close to the Pacific Ocean, they dived off the coast for fish. DNA analysis shows that 94% of Chinchorro diets came from sea proteins, and many mummies left behind by the Chinchorro were found to have bony growths in the ear canal, something that happens when your ears are constantly exposed to cold water. The Chinchorro were not the only ancient divers though. Ancient Greeks were also free diving, this time for sea sponges. They were one of the first to use technology to their assistance. Ancient Greeks would tie themselves with a heavy rock towards the sea sponge. And all this hard work was used by the Greeks to wipe their ass. I'm not joking, the entire community would use the same one. Many other cultures also regularly deep dived. But with the most advanced technology being a rock and a rope, we can conservatively assume most divers bottomed out around the 40-meter mark. The first documented dive happened in 1949, when Raimondo Butcher made a bet with his Air Force captain that he could dive to 30 meters deep. Medics around the time were convinced this was a suicide mission, but also they were kind of trying to see what would happen, so they just told him go for it. And to everyone's surprise, after a couple minutes, Raimondo resurfaced and won his $1,000 prize. Raimondo's dive became pretty popular and was a headline in the news, which was read by many Italians at the time, including two men named Alberto and Ennio. Alberto was a doctor at the time, but he realized that A, he wasn't a fan of this whole doctorate thing, and B, that using a breathing technique, he could purge his body of most of its CO2, which means he could dive way deeper and for way longer. And in the next 7 years that Alberto spent freediving with this technique, he pushed the record down by 5 meters and then by another 6. With the turn of the new century, no-limit freediving started to become much more widespread, and with the new attention came many new talented freedivers. The first to make his mark in the world was Americo, a guy from Brazil who dived to 53 meters in 1960. This record didn't last though, as one of the most prolific freedivers made his mark that year, and his name was Enzo Miarco. Enzo was a spearfisher, but one day, as he was hunting for fish, he had an epiphany that, as a spearfisher, he was spearing fish, an unpleasant experience for the fish. So then he became vegetarian. Anyway, after quitting spearfishing, he saw a news article of Alberto setting his world record dive, and immediately started training to make the record his own. And just a year later, Enzo Miarco became the first man ever to dive to 50 meters. Now this is great and all, but it raises the question of just how Enzo was even able to survive. Before Enzo made his dive, medics warned him it was a suicide mission, as the body can only withstand so much pressure. Water pressure is one of the main bottlenecks for just how far a diver can actually dive. For context, Enzo's 50-meter dive is about 16 times deeper than most Olympic pools are. And if you've ever dived to the bottom of one of those, you would know that your ears will instantly start hurting and your body will feel more pressure on itself. This is water pressure. It's the weight of all the water that's on top of you. And the deeper you go, the higher the water pressure. On dry land, there is only one atmospheric pressure. At the bottom of an Olympic pool, there is an extra third of it. At the depth Enzo swam, there is 6 times the atmospheric pressure. When Enzo resurfaced, medics checked to see if he was injured, but surprisingly, he had no injuries. The reason is the human body is surprisingly resilient to water pressure, and the organs like your lungs, which would usually collapse under the pressure, are saved by TBS, or thoracic blood shift, which moves blood out of your limbs and into your lungs to fill up volume, which saves them from collapsing under the pressure. So while water pressure is technically a bottleneck, in reality, you've got to go much deeper for it to become a problem. Anyway, back to Enzo, who after 4 years of dominance finally lost his record streak to a 59-meter record by Titike Williams, a guy who was Polynesian, and that's pretty much all I could find on him. So good job, man. Later that year though, the second great of the era made his entrance, Jacques Maillol. Jacques was a Frenchman who came from a family of divers, and spent many of his early years in Japan, where he frequently dived off the coast and even saw dolphins face to face. He also made his first appearance in the record book that year, diving to 60 meters. Except there was one issue. See, Jacques Malal was actually not the first person to dive to 60 meters. In fact, every single world record I've named so far was not actually the world record. Why? Because of Stoti Georgis. Guys, I'm not even gonna try with the names anymore. Anyway, who is Stoti? A random Greek Navy man who in 1913 took the task of salvaging an anchor off an old sunken ship 60 meters deep. This is with literally no protective gear and only a rock to help him sink to that depth. His prize, €5 and permission to fish with dynamite. Oh, also life lung damage and ruptured eardrums. And then the rest of the world just kind of forgot about this. But regardless, up until this point, he was the true world record holder. Anyway, back to the 60s, where in a US naval submarine base, a beast was training. He was a seasoned swimmer who could stay underwater for 6 minutes and sit comfortably at a depth of 35 meters for over 3 minutes. He was a legend among men, and his name was Bob. It's an anticlimactic name, but regardless, he pushed the record down another 4 meters, and he was able to do this with a technique called air packing. The idea is that you take a deep breath, compress that air into your lungs, and then continue to take small sips of air, which eventually adds more and more air to your lungs. On top of packing extra volume into the lungs, divers also had more oxygen to work with, which helped fight against the second, much more dangerous bottlenecks divers face, hypoxia. Like I said, no limit divers only get one breath before diving, so the second they go underwater, a clock starts ticking. With every second that passes, oxygen gets used up and gets replaced by CO2. And if enough CO2 is built up, the worst case scenario that can happen to a diver happens. Shallow water blackout. It causes divers to lose consciousness and start drowning. Even if a diver loses consciousness for just a minute, every second that organs like the brain are deprived of oxygen and drowning can lead to permanent damage and usually death. Anyway, back to Jacques and Enzo, who after integrating air packing, were now in a race to see who would be the first man to touch 100 meters. Jacques made the first push in 67 with a 6-meter jump to 70 meters. Enzo, not to be bested, came back 6 years later with a massive jump to 80 meters. A year later, Enzo was going to go for 90, this time live in front of Italian television, but the dive ended up only reaching 20 meters because some other Italian named Enzo bumped into diver Enzo, which completely screwed up his run. If that's not bad enough, Enzo resurfaced back on his boat, extremely pissed because his world record attempt was now ruined, and went, "I hope you," and then she'll be all up on my. Obviously, not a good look for Enzo, especially when you're on national TV. So Enzo got banned off national airways for a bit. Jacques, on the other hand, was on a hot streak. In 1975, he dived 92 meters, and a year later, Malal became the first man to touch 100 meters underwater. Jacques' 101 meter dive marked the end of official records, as CMAS, the guys who were keeping records up until this point, decided to not take any new ones because they were getting too dangerous. This did not stop anyone, because 6 years later, Angelina Bandini became the first woman to take the world record, diving to a depth of 107 meters. Then, later that same year, Francisco Pippin Ferrares took the record down to 112 meters. Pippin was a Cuban spearfisher. Some Italians told him about no-limit freediving, and indirectly introduced one of the most dominant divers ever to the sport. And back in Italy, another diver named Umberto Pellerazzi, who had records in pretty much every other discipline of diving, now had his eyes set on no-limit freediving, with the two of them gunning to see who could get the deepest dive. Much like Jacques and Enzo from 20 years ago, the stage was set for an absolute showdown. Over the next 15 years, they played hot potato with the record, until in 96, Pellerazzi drove the record down to 133 meters. Then, in 99, a Frenchman named Loïc Leferme took the record down another 2 meters. For a while, it seemed like the record could only be bested by a meter or two. Maybe CO2 buildup was just too dangerous, or maybe the human body just couldn't handle the pressures anymore. Pellerazzi proved them wrong. Things were heating up again. In 2002, Tanya Streeter became the second woman to ever break the record, diving another 10 meters to 160. Loïc Leferme came back with an 11-meter push down to 171. And then in 2005, one of the most important things happened. I was born. But also, Herbert Nitsch started freediving. Originally an Australian pilot, he once was supposed to go scuba diving on vacation, but lost all his gear and decided to go freediving instead. In just that 10-day vacation, competition, Herbert dove within 2 meters of the Austrian world record, so obviously the guy was talented. Herbert planned to push the world record with 2 strategies. One way was training to make sure he could ensure he had a massive lung capacity, and the second was optimize and innovate as much technology as he could to give him the largest edge possible. And after creating all of this stuff, in just 2 years, Herbert did this. But Herbert was not done yet. 5 years after these massive jumps, Herbert intended to take another huge leap to 253 meters, but then tragedy struck. Herbert descended to 253 meters without a hitch, but as he started to come back up, an issue arose. See, on his way back up, Herbert had nitrogen narcosis. Nitrogen narcosis is when a diver starts to get impaired from breathing in nitrogen at very high pressures. In Herbert's case, it led him to become unconscious. If this wasn't bad enough, Herbert going unconscious meant that he needed to immediately be brought back up to surface. An issue because if a diver does not descend slowly to depressurize, they also face decompression sickness. The gist is that nitrogen, which gets dissolved in your tissues at deep depths, will bubble up inside your tissue if you enter the surface too fast, and the result is not good. Herbert went through multiple strokes and was immediately transported via speedboat to a hospital, where by all accounts he should have been paralyzed for the rest of his life. Herbert was immensely depressed and even thought about jumping off of the window from his building. But then he realized his room was only 2 floors up, so he would have been paralyzed and had broken feet. Anyway, luckily for him, he was able to make a full recovery and still lives and free dives today. It's been 12 years since Herbert set his dangerous world record, an abnormally large time for the sport to go without one. And you know, honestly, it might be for the best. It makes you wonder if what Herbert did really was the limit to no limit freediving. Also, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, like and subscribe. Check out the Patreon. I put videos there early. Have a good day. Goodbye.